Magnus Carlsen is the greatest chess player of all time, and in this video, I'm going to show you how Magnus uses the Ruy Lopez opening as white to destroy some of the strongest chess grandmasters in the world today, including Hans Niemann, Hikaru Nakamura, Ding Liren, and more. Of course, the Ruy Lopez isn't opening for white. It occurs after the moves e4, e5, then knight f3, knight c6, and finally bishop b5. This is the key move in the Ruy Lopez, where white gets the bishop out to the b5 square and pressures the knight on c6, which is currently defending the pawn on e5. Now, in game number 1, Magnus Carlsen is playing against Hikaru Nakamura. He is currently the number 2 rated player in the world and an absolute monster with black in the Ruy Lopez. Now, Hikaru specializes in a very popular line in the Ruy Lopez called the Berlin defense, and the Berlin defense starts with the move knight to f6. So what is black's idea here? Well, first of all, he's getting the knight out to the wonderful f6 square. He might follow up developing the bishop and try to castle really fast. However, beyond that, there's also pressure on the e4 square right away, and no matter what white does, he has to make some sort of concession to defend the pawn on e4. Now, first of all, it's important to note that Magnus Carlsen cannot win the pawn on e5 right away. For example, if Magnus were to try to take the knight on c6, bishop takes, then d takes. Here, if white tries to win that pawn on the e5 square, black has the very deadly move queen to d4, forking both the knight on e5 as well as the pawn on e4. So clearly that is not a very good idea for white in this position here. Now, as white, there are a couple of main options. There is short castles and the solid move d3. Now, Magnus Carlsen does play both, but he is a big fan of the move d3, trying to maintain tension in the position, and that is exactly what Magnus Carlsen does here. Now, from here, Hikaru plays the most popular and strongest line, that is bishop c5. Hikaru is simply developing the bishop on the best possible square, and from there he may have ideas like short castles next. Now, as white, there are a number of different options that you can choose here in this position against the Berlin defense. Perhaps the most popular line at the highest level is taking the knight on c6. However, there are a bunch of other options. c3 is playable, short castles is playable, even knight d2 is good here. However, in this game, Magnus Carlsen throws a bit of a curveball and plays a very interesting line that you can use in your own games. That is the move bishop to a4. Now, the idea behind this move is white is getting the bishop out of the way of a future a6 advance, and later, if white is to go c3 and potentially d4, trying to gain space in the center, the bishop could always cut back to the c2 square. The bishop a4 here is a very clever waiting move by Magnus Carlsen, and he definitely popularized this line at the highest level. Now, from here, both sides play very logical-looking Ruy Lopez moves. Black goes d6, bolstering as the pawn on e5, both sides castles, and then here, Magnus Carlsen goes c3. Of course, the idea is to threaten to go d4 in the future, and perhaps also bishop c2 at some point, getting the bishop back to the c2 square where it defends the pawn on e4. Now, of course, Magnus is not threatening to go d4 right away. There is simply too much pressure on the e4 pawn. However, Magnus Carlsen continues to build up towards that idea. Now, from here, Hikaru playing h6, trying to take control of the g5 square, and Magnus Carlsen does the same thing. h3, stopping knight g4 and bishop g4. Now, Hikaru, bishop b6. This is a very common idea in the Italian game, but it works here as well, simply getting out of the way of a d4 advance preemptively. Now, Magnus, knight b to d2, a very common Ruy Lopez idea. Because white has that pawn on the c3 square, the knight simply cannot go there. So instead, Magnus puts it on d2, and he may go something like rook e1 and then knight f1 to g3 in the future, and g3 is often the best square for the knight in the Ruy Lopez. Now, from here, Hikaru starts to play kind of a series of strange-looking moves. First of all, he plays the move a6. Now, this is a very common move in the Ruy Lopez, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense here. Typically, when you play the move a6, you want to put your bishop on a7 in one go, but now it's on the b6 square. So not a disaster, but already sort of a slight inaccuracy from Hikaru. Now, Magnus, rook e1, very solid move, defending the e4 pawn and preparing the idea of knight f1 to g3. So far, so good. And now Hikaru, he goes bishop to a6, e7, and this is clearly a mistake. I mean, if you wanted to go bishop a7, why wouldn't you go bishop c5 to a7 in one go, instead of going bishop b6 and then bishop a7 later? That is just simply a wasted tempo. Now Magnus, knight f1, continuing the plan, and here Hikaru goes knight e7. Hikaru is doing almost the same thing as white. He wants to reroute the knight from c6 way over to the g6 square, and he may also want to go c6 and then d5 at some point, trying to take control of the center. However, now that the knight is no longer on c6 and no longer pressures the d4 square, Magnus realizes it is time to seize control of the center, and he strikes immediately with the move d4. Wow, fantastic stuff by Magnus. We're already seeing his Ruy Lopez plan in action, simply getting the rook on e1, the knight on g3, and taking control of the center with moves c3 and d4. So very instructive stuff. Now both sides finish rerouting their knights, knight g6 and knight g3. Now here, Hikaru decides it is time to counterattack on the queen side. He does that starting with the move b5, and then after bishop c2, he strikes with c5. Now this idea of c5 and b5 is extremely common from black in the Ruy Lopez. While white gets the center on d4 and e4, black tries to counterattack on the queen side, getting more space on that part of the board. Now white has pretty much achieved his dream setup in the Ruy Lopez here, with the knights on f3 and g3, the pawns on d4 and e4, the bishop on c2 supporting e4. So now what is white supposed to do to further improve the position? Well, the best plan here for Magnus Carlsen is just to continue putting more pressure on the black position. So here Magnus has all sorts of ideas. In the game, he goes a4, trying to chop down at the pawn on b5 and opening up the a file for the rook potentially. Of course, there were plenty of other good moves here, including bishop e3, the engine's top choice, and even a3 or b4, trying to gain space on the queen side. So all of these very playable ideas, a4 played in the game by Magnus. Now Hikaru, he goes bishop b7 in this position. His idea is he wants to get the bishop out onto the long diagonal, where it's pressuring e4 and is very, very active. Now Magnus, from here, bishop e3, simply bolstering the pawn on d4. However, I do want to point out, now that the bishop is no longer on this diagonal here, it turns out the strongest move is simply knight to f5, and that knight on the f5 square is an absolute monster. White is even threatening knight takes h6 or bishop takes h6 in some lines, and black is going to have to be incredibly careful. However, instead of that, bishop e3 on the board by Magnus, very solid move. Now from here, Hikaru makes yet another mistake. He tries to gain more space on the queen side with the move b4. However, instead of that, taking in the center may have been a better idea. Now from here, Magnus really starts to take over in this game. He starts with the move a5. Now this is a very long-term strategic move. Magnus Carlsen's idea is he wants to cut off that a6 square from the pawn on b4. And now we can see the pawn on a6 is going to be vulnerable throughout the game. However, beyond that, Magnus Carlsen also gains space on the queen side, and he gains access to the critical a4 square for his bishop and his rook. And that a4 square is going to be incredibly important in many different lines throughout this game. Now from here, Hikaru starts to show his idea. He takes on b3, b takes, then he takes on d4, c takes. Now from here, Hikaru has to figure out how to continue getting his pieces into the game. And now the most typical moves for black in this kind of position are going to be things like queen c7, rook c8, rook e8, simply getting the queen or the rooks into the game. However, Hikaru goes for the move bishop c6. Now to me, this move looks very strange. The bishop is a little bit more exposed on the c6 square, especially if white goes d5 in the future. Now maybe Hikaru wanted to go rook b8 next, gaining control of the b file. However, overall, this move, developing a piece that's already developed to a slightly worse square, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Now Magnus, queen d2. This move may look innocent, but it has a very deadly idea behind it. Here, Magnus Carlsen is actually threatening the idea of bishop takes h6. Of course, after the pawn takes, the queen takes back on h6, and Magnus may have a big attack for the piece. So, what does Hikaru do in response? Well, in the game, he goes rook to e8. A solid developing move normally. However, in this position, he had to defend against the threat of bishop takes h6. Real fast, instead of that, the best move here would have been king to h7, simply defending the pawn and making it more difficult for white to do that sacrifice. However, rook e8 played in the game, and here Magnus Carlsen unleashes his big idea. bishop takes h6. An absolutely brilliant move, blowing open the black king side after g takes and queen takes. Now from here, Hikaru is fighting for his life, and Magnus is just sitting back, laughing, getting ready to blow Hikaru off the board. Of course, the threat here for white is simply knight f5 and then queen g7 checkmate when the knight also defends the g7 square. So Hikaru, he has to act immediately. He starts queen e7. The idea behind this move is he wants to go queen f8 next, defending the g7 square. However, it's not enough. Magnus Carlsen, he plays the move bishop to b3. Now, at first glance, this move doesn't do a whole lot. I mean, black already has the f7 square defended, but that is not the idea of bishop b3. Here, the bishop actually pins that pawn on f7 to the king, meaning white is threatening queen takes g6. Oh my goodness, here Hikaru, he is a master defender. He finds the best move. That is d5. This move simply blocks the bishop's attack on the f7 square, meaning the knight is no longer pinned on g6. However, Magnus is ready. He starts d takes e5. And now Hikaru's best defensive idea is actually queen to f8, trying to give back the sacrificed piece. Here, real fast, the line goes like this. Queen to f8, then Magnus takes the queen on f8, then Magnus takes back the knight. Both sides now have 3 minor pieces, and then Hikaru takes on e4. Overall, Magnus is still up 2 pawns. He has a big advantage here. However, Hikaru still has some chances. So instead of all this, instead of the best move, queen to f8, here Hikaru takes on e5 with the knight. Knight takes c5. However, this is a big mistake. Magnus, he jumps in with the knight to the f5 square. Knight to f5. Of course, Magnus hitting the queen on e7 and also threatening queen g7 through checkmate in one move. Oh my goodness, the audacity of this madman. Okay, Hikaru, he's a tricky player. He has one big idea left up his sleeve. Here on move 25, Hikaru sacrifices the bishop. Bishop takes f2. Now, if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to figure out what Hikaru was planning if white was to take on f2 with the king. I'm telling you, Hikaru has an unbelievable idea right here, so go ahead and pause the video and try to figure it out. Okay, if you found it, the idea is if the king takes on f2, then Hikaru jumps into the g4 square with the knight. Knight e to g4. Oh my goodness, the knight forks the king and the queen. And if Magnus takes the first knight, Hikaru jumps in with knight number 2, and now for sure that queen on h6 is going to be lost. Of course, Hikaru did sacrifice a number of pieces to win the queen there. I mean, white can go king g3, black takes the queen, white takes the queen on e7, knight takes, rook takes, and in the end, white still has an advantage. However, Hikaru again would have had fighting chances here. So instead of this big line starting with king takes f2, Magnus Carlsen dodges it. He goes king to h1 instead. Now, of course, Magnus is hanging the rook on e1, but if Hikaru takes it, Magnus just delivers checkmate on the g7 square. So that rook on e1 is not really hanging yet. Okay, here, Hikaru, queen f8, defending against the checkmate threat by controlling g7. But now Magnus, queen takes f6, he just picks up the knight. And if Hikaru takes on e1, Magnus can win the bishop there or the knight on e5. Okay, here, Hikaru, he has one last idea. Rook e6, trying to challenge the queen. Where does it go? Well, Magnus just goes queen g5, delivering a check. The knight on e5 retreats to g6. And finally, Magnus goes rook to f1, defending the rook. And in this position on move 29, Hikaru Nakamura resigns to the unstoppable Magnus Carlsen. So that was the first game. Magnus Carlsen showing an excellent weapon against the Berlin defense with the move knight to f6, where he goes d3, and then at bishop c5, he simply retreats the bishop back to the a4 square, then continues developing short castles, c3, potentially d4 later, and white here has a little nagging edge throughout the middle game, so a very good weapon. Now in game number 2, we have Magnus Carlsen facing off against his arch nemesis, Hans Niemann. Now in the game, Magnus opens 1e4, we head for a Ruy Lopez as usual. This is Magnus Carlsen's favorite opening after all. And here, Hans Niemann, instead of going knight f6 with the Berlin defense like Hikaru did in the last game, here he starts with the move a6. Now of course, this move move a6, black is not hanging a pawn. If white were to take the knight on c6, black takes back with the d-pawn. And then if white ever captures knight takes e5, black has that resource queen to d4, forking both the knight on e5 and the pawn on e4. So here on move 4, Magnus Carlsen plays the best move in the position. That is simply bishop to a4. Magnus keeps the bishop alive. That bishop is very, very important in the Ruy Lopez. Now Hans Niemann, knight f6. And here Magnus Carlsen castles. This is the most popular and strongest move, and it leads to a lot of different interesting variations. Now, first of all, you might be wondering, why did Magnus Carlsen castle instead of defending the pawn on e4 with d3 or knight to c3? I mean, isn't Hans Niemann simply threatening to take knight takes e4 in this position? Well, it turns out castling short here is the best move, and I'm going to show you why. If black takes the pawn on e4, as Hans Niemann did in the game, this is called the open variation of the Ruy Lopez, and it gets that name because the positions here become very, very open with a lot of pieces moving around very quickly. So knight takes e4 on the board. Now the strongest move, and the one Magnus Carlsen played in this game, is the move d4. And the threat here is very simple. Magnus Carlsen wants to win the pawn on the e5 square, and if Hans Niemann instead plays e takes d4, then this e-file becomes completely opened up. Magnus puts his rook on the e1 square, pinning the knight on e4, and that is going to be incredibly dangerous for black. So instead of that, here Hans Niemann, he plays the standard idea. First of all, b5, breaking the tension with the bishop on the knight. That is very important. Now Magnus, obviously, he retreats the bishop, bishop b3, and here Hans Niemann plays the standard move in the open Spanish or the open Ruy Lopez. That is the move d5, simply bolstering the knight on the e4 square and gaining more space in the center. Now Magnus takes the pawn on e5 with the pawn, d takes e5, and now white is threatening bishop takes d5 or queen takes d5. So here Hans Niemann, he defends the pawn on d5 with the bishop, bishop e6. Now if you made it this far, this is the starting point of the open Ruy Lopez or the open Spanish. Now this variation is very different from other lines in the Ruy Lopez because black here has a ton of piece activity. I mean, his knight on e4 in particular is very, very active, and he is very easy development for the rest of his pieces. His bishop can go to e7 or c5. He can short castle very fast. So at first glance, black's position looks very, very good. However, there is one weakness of this variation for black. As we can see, black's pawns on the queen side are a little bit weak. That pawn on d5 can be attacked, and his pawns on a6 and b5 can also be attacked very easily by the move a4 from Magnus Carlsen. So as we can see, this is going to be a battle between black's piece activity and white's superior pawn structure. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen has a ton of different options on the white side of the Ruy Lopez. Lately, he's been playing a lot of the idea queen e2 and then rook d1. However, in this particular game, Magnus Carlsen plays the absolute strongest line as white, and that is the one where you go some combination of knight to d2, c3, and bishop c2. So overall, that is the strongest setup for white in this position, getting the knight out and the bishop on c2, all of that pressuring that very important knight on the e4 square from black. Okay, Magnus Carlsen, he starts c3, and now here Hans Niemann has a choice. The standard move, of course, is bishop e7, intending short castles next. However, instead of that, here Hans Niemann, he throws Magnus a big curveball, and he goes for the move bishop c5. Now, why is bishop c5 less common than bishop e7? I mean, after all, the bishop does look a little bit more active on the c5 square. It pressures f2, which is more active in general. Well, I'll show you why. Here, Magnus, he continues with the standard plan. Knight to d2, Hans Niemann castles, and Magnus goes bishop c2. Now Hans Niemann has to do something about the knight on the e4 square. What's he going to do? Well, typically, the standard developing move for the knight is knight to c5, getting it out of the way of the attack. However, of course, that bishop on c5 currently occupies the c5 square, and that means knight c5 is never going to happen. Well, it turns out Hans Niemann, he wanted to pick a fight with Magnus Carlsen in this game, and he came prepared with a very specific idea. In this position, Hans Niemann sacrifices the knight. That's right, Hans Niemann jumps in with the knight. Knight takes f2. The idea is he wants to trade these minor pieces for the pawn and the rook on f1, and that is exactly what happens. Knight takes, rook takes, takes, bishop takes, king takes. Now from here, Hans Niemann, he came prepared. He starts by trying to open up the f-file with the move f6. Of course, the threat is simply f takes e5 when the rook barrels down on the f-file, pointing towards the white king. Now Magnus, he gets the king out of the line of sight, king to g1, and Hans Niemann simply takes on e5, f takes e5. Now from here, obviously, Magnus Carlsen cannot take the pawn on the e5 square. It is currently defended by the knight on c6, so with that in mind, Magnus reroutes his knight to f1, intending knight e3 or knight to g3. So knight to f1 on the board, the strongest move, and this move also opens up the way for the bishop on c1 to enter the game. So very critical idea. Now Hans Niemann, he follows up queen to d6. Again, the best move. His idea is he wants to get the queen to the center of the game, and he wants to bring his rook on a8 over into the game on d8 or e8. Very good stuff. Now Magnus, bishop g5 on the board. Very logical developing move. Overall, a pretty good square for the bishop. And here is where Hans Niemann really tries to press in this game and make something happen. He pushes forward with the pawn e4. Okay, this is a very double-edged move. It's double-edged because on the one hand, Hans Niemann is gaining more space in the center, and he gets that beautiful e5 square for the knight. However, it also gives Magnus Carlsen the d4 square for his own knight, and that is pretty much what happens. Magnus goes knight to d4, and here Hans Niemann knight to e5 in response. Now Magnus Carlsen, his next step is to get that knight on f1 into the game, and he decides to bring it to the e3 square instead of g3. He goes knight to e3, very good move, pressuring squares like f5 and d5. And as a side note, whenever you have your knight on the f1 square in the Ruy Lopez, you really got to consider, do you want to bring it to e3 or g3? Because both of these squares have their own advantages and disadvantages. So overall, g3, typically the best square for the knight, but there are plenty of circumstances where e3 is actually better, where you want that knight pressuring f5 and d5. Now here on move 18, Hans Niemann, bishop d7, a little bit of a passive move. He wants to get the bishop out of the way of the attack of the knight, but I'm not such a big fan. And here Magnus Carlsen develops a really strong idea. That is the move bishop h4. Magnus Carlsen's idea, it's very simple but very dangerous. He wants to go bishop g3, and from there, that bishop puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the queen and this diagonal in general. Okay, Hans Niemann, what the heck is he supposed to do? Well, here he makes the first mistake of the game. So what he does is he swings his queen over to the king side with the move queen h6. Now, the queen looks very active here. He's hitting both the bishop and the knight. I mean, how could this possibly be a bad move for Hans Niemann? Well, the problem is after knight f5, suddenly Magnus Carlsen is attacking both the queen and defending all of these pieces here. I mean, what a superstar of a piece. Now Hans, he starts by knocking off that first knight on f5, bishop takes, knight takes. And here you might be wondering, wait a minute, isn't Magnus Carlsen simply hanging the rook on the f5 square? Well, real fast, that is not the case. If Hans Niemann were to take that knight on f5, that is a big blunder. We're giving it 2 question marks. Here, Magnus Carlsen has the very simple for queen takes d5, forking the king and the rook on a8. That is going to be almost game over. So, of course, that was not played in this game. Instead, Hans Niemann, he finds a very resourceful idea. That is the move, knight to f3, hitting the king with check. Okay, why is that move so strong? Well, if Magnus Carlsen were to take back with the g-pawn, g takes f3, then here Hans Niemann could take back on f5 with the rook, and suddenly the rook is defending the d5 square because the knight is no longer on e5 blocking the rook. So wow, fantastic stuff. Instead of that, here Magnus Carlsen takes back with the queen. This looks completely insane. I mean, you're just bringing your queen into the line of attack. However, there is an idea. The queen both defends the f5 square, and of course Hans Niemann's queen on h6 is also being attacked, so both sides with these queen attacks, the queens are hanging everywhere. Now from here, Hans Niemann, he has a choice. He can try to liquidate into an endgame with the move queen takes h4. That is technically the strongest move. However, instead of that, Hans Niemann, he decides to fight on with the move queen b6 check, hitting the king. Now Magnus queen e3, offering a queen trade, and Hans Niemann again complicates things with rook takes f5, removing the defender of the queen. Of course, Magnus is no dummy. He just takes on b6, queen takes, c takes, then he goes bishop f2, rerouting the bishop to this critical diagonal, pressuring b6. Now, real fast, let's do inventory. We are in an endgame. Magnus Carlsen has 2 bishops versus Hans Niemann's rook and 2 pawns. Normally, that would be a material advantage for black. However, black has so many pawn weaknesses all over the board, and these bishops are just absolute monsters. So overall, Magnus Carlsen here does have an advantage despite technically being down material. Now, from here, Magnus, he just slowly improves his position. He goes bishop b3, pressuring the d5 pawn with the bishop. Then after Hans Niemann defends, rook d4, blockading those pawns. Those pawns are now permanent weaknesses. Now, from here, Hans Niemann plays a big mistake, king e7. This allows Magnus to win the pawn on d5 right away. And from here, material is technically equal, but Magnus Carlsen's 2 bishops are just so much more powerful than black's rook and the weak pawn on e4. So from here, Magnus Carlsen essentially just cleans up in the endgame. There is no competition, and in this position on move 36, Hans Niemann resigns. Wow, what an interesting game in the open Ruy Lopez. Hans Niemann coming prepared with that very dangerous knight sacrifice with the move knight takes f2 on move 11 right here, but overall, Magnus Carlsen, he was just too good in this game. He defended too well, and in the end, he cinched the victory. Now, heading into game number 3, we have Magnus Carlsen versus Fabiano Caruana from the 2023 Chess.com International Rapid Tournament. Now, Fabiano Caruana is a big Ruy Lopez expert with both sides, and he's really popularized a variation for black called the Archengelsk variation. So let's see what Fabiano's idea is in this game. Here, Magnus opens e4. We have a Ruy Lopez on the board with bishop b5. Now, Fabiano's pet line starts with a6, bishop a4, knight f6, and castles, just as we saw in the last game. Now here, instead of knight takes e4 like Hans Niemann did in game number 2, Fabiano Caruana goes for the other idea, b5, then bishop b3, and finally bishop to c5. This is the official starting point of the Archengelsk variation that Fabiano Caruana loves to play as black. So what is the idea behind this move? Well, it's simple. c5 is simply the best and most active square for the bishop in this position. From here, the bishop slices down the board, hits the f2 pawn, and puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the white position. Of course, there are drawbacks to having the bishop on the c5 square. The safer move is simply bishop e7, and we'll cover that in the next game. However, here, bishop c5, that bishop is very vulnerable. If white goes c3 and d4 in the future, the bishop's going to be hit with tempo. It'll have to retreat, and the bishop might be a little bit sidelined on the b6 square in the future. So overall, this line is very aggressive and very sharp in contrast to the other line started with bishop to e7. Now from here in this game, Magnus Carlsen plays a very simple idea that you can use in your own games. It's pretty simple but very, very effective. Here Magnus starts c3, and after d6 from black, he takes control of the center with d4. Now Fabi, he retreats bishop b6, and now typically in the Archengelsk variation, white is going to pressure on the queen side started with move a4. However, here, Magnus, he completely abandons that idea and instead simply plays in the middle of the board with the move bishop to e3. His idea is he wants to go bishop e3, then knight to d2, and both the bishop and the knight simply bolster the center really, really well. And then from there, Magnus, if he gets that far, he can go rook e1, h3, perhaps queen c2 or queen e2, and then eventually think about gaining space on the queen side with moves like a4 in the future. Now, Fabiano Caruana, in response, he goes for the move short castles. Of course, there is a completely different line starting with bishop to g4, and that bishop is super active on the g4 square. Things get very complicated, but we're not going to talk about it in this video. Instead of this game here, Fabi goes short castles. That is probably the most popular move here. And now Magnus, knight to d2. Fabi goes rook e8. And rook e1 for Magnus. Now Fabi h6 controlling the g5 square, and Magnus does the same, h3 controlling g4. So once again, we see Magnus Carlsen getting this typical kind of Ruy Lopez structure in the center. Of course, he has the pawns on e4 and d4, the d4 pawn being supported by the pawn on c3, and beyond that, he has the rook on e1, knight on f3, and thinking about ideas like knight f1 to g3 in the future. Now here, Fabiano, he has a wide range of ideas and different different moves that he could play. For example, moves like rook b8, bishop b7, and bishop d7 are all possible. However, instead of playing a slower waiting move here, Fabi, he immediately takes the fight to Magnus Carlsen. He is not afraid of the GOAT of chess. And here in this position, he immediately takes on d4, e takes d4, c takes d4, and then knight to b4. Okay, this is a very interesting move here. Fabiano Caruana, he goes knight b4 to free up the c pawn on c7. He wants to go c5 next. So what does Magnus do? Well, he starts queen e2, getting the queen to a better square, and now c5 from Fabi. Now, in this position, the best move according to the computer is the move rook a to d1, and if black takes on d4, white just recaptures with the knight with a tremendous position. So, for example, rook d1, c takes, knight takes, and this is just very, very good for Magnus. However, instead of that, Magnus tries to be a little bit cute here. He goes a3, trying to hit the knight. However, here, Fabi, he does not have to retreat knight c6. Instead, he brings the fight to Magnus with the insane-looking move c4. Oh boy, here both the knight and the bishop are both hanging. Here's what happens. Magnus takes the knight on b4, and Fabi takes on b3. Now, from here, Magnus goes d5, trying to lock the center. Then we have bishop takes, queen takes. And now here we have yet another different pawn structure in the Ruy Lopez. There are just so many different possible pawn structures for both sides. That is one of the things that makes the Ruy Lopez such an interesting variation and why grandmasters continue to play it at the highest level. There are just so many different possibilities for both sides. But before we talk about that, here Fabiano Caruana, he notices something. Here the queen is lined up with the rook on e8, and for that reason Fabi immediately takes the pawn on d5. Knight takes d5. Now, yes, Fabiano does win a clean pawn. However, Magnus Carlsen has good attacking chances. He doesn't mind so much. Now, from here, queen d4 from Magnus. Very good move. Of course, he is eyeing the knight on d5, and he's going to recapture on b3 with the knight next. Now, Fabiano, knight to f4. That f4 square is always going to be such a dangerous square for a knight to be on. So Magnus has to be on his A game. He has to be very, very careful about that. Of course, there are some lines where Fabiano is actually threatening knight takes h3 or bishop takes h3. However, for the moment, he's not too concerned. He proceeds, knight takes b3, winning back that missing pawn. Now, Fabiano, bishop e6, threatening that knight on the b3 square, and instead of retreating like a typical normal human, here Magnus Carlsen, he jumps forward with the knight to the a5 square, knight to a5. Oh boy, got a little bit of Magnus Carlsen flair in this position. Now, Fabiano, queen d7, lining up threats against that pawn on h3. I mean, I told you this line from black is sharp, but wow. Okay, now here Magnus, he recognizes the threat. If he wastes a move, let's say rook b1, then Fabi is immediately going to take on h3 with the bishop. So of course, he does not do that. Instead, he plays the move queen e3, pressuring that knight on f4. And now here Fabi, he has a choice. The move he played in the game is g5, simply bolstering that knight on the f4 square. However, he also had the absolutely insane idea, knight takes g2. Now, I don't want to get too caught up in the details of this move, but the main idea is if white recaptures with the king, Fabiano is going to recapture on h3 with the bishop, and then he can even follow up with queen g4 next. Now, this is super sharp. Magnus is still fighting for an edge, but absolutely anything could happen in this line. However, instead of that, g5 is played on the board by Fabiano Caruana. Now, Magnus, knight d4, eyeing the f5 square with the knight, and Fabiano plays f5 himself, gaining even more space on the king side. Now, of course, this is a very double-edged move. That king has so much air around it. It's going to be very, very dangerous if Magnus can get some counterplay going. Now, Magnus, queen to g3, getting the queen out of the way of that open e-file with the rook on e8. And from here, f takes, rook takes, Magnus recapturing with the rook. That is the idea of queen g3. And here, believe it or not, Magnus is actually threatening rook takes f4 because that pawn on the g5 square that is defending the knight, it is currently pinned to the king by the queen. Oh my goodness. Okay, here, Fabiano, he spots the threat. Queen f7, defending the knight on f4. Now, Magnus Carlsen, he finds an absolutely ridiculous idea in this position. That is the idea, knight b7. e7. Okay, first of all, that knight is hanging. The queen can take it, but if the queen takes it, then Magnus takes on f4 with the rook. So that is the first idea here. Well, the best move here for Fabi is bishop d5, forking that rook and the knight. However, that is not what's played in the game. Instead, Fabiano, he takes the knight with the queen. Oh my goodness. This is not a good move because now the queen is further away from the defense of the king. And here Magnus simply takes the pinned knight on f4. Okay, now Fabi, no dummy. He knows he has to get that queen back to the king side immediately. Queen g7 played, and now Magnus rook e4, getting the rook out of the attack of that g-pawn. Now here the dust has mostly settled, but overall it looks like Black's king is going to be less safe than Magnus Carlsen's on the g1 square. How about that? Okay, here, Fabiano Caruana, he does not want to wait and sit around. He lashes out with the move bishop takes h3. Okay, this looks insane, but there are some tactical ideas behind it. First of all, if Magnus takes that bishop on h3, then Fabi takes the rook on e4 as the rook is hanging. And beyond that, if Magnus takes, trying to do that before winning the bishop, then that knight on the d4 square is going to hang as that rook on e4 is no longer there defending it. So, for example, rook takes, queen takes, then queen takes d4 is going to be the move. Now, instead of all of this, here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, he finds the strongest move in the position. That is the move. Queen b3, hitting the king. Now, you may be wondering, why is this move so good? Well, it turns out this move gains a tempo in a very critical variation. Here, Fabiano plays king to h8, the best move. But now Magnus plays that old idea of taking on e8, then taking the bishop. Rook takes, queen takes, and now queen takes. And here, this is the key difference in this position. Instead of being on g8, the king is over here on h8, and that means Magnus Carlsen takes on h6 with tempo against the king. The king's in check, it has to move, but now queen takes g5, and here Magnus Carlsen is actually the one up a pawn. And not only is he up one pawn, these passed pawns on f2 and g2 are absolute monsters. Oh no, this is so difficult for Fabiano. He tries to hold on, king f8, and here Magnus Carlsen simply says, all right, g3. There are never ever going to be any back wreck mate threats. And again, Fabiano tries to hang on, but in the end, Magnus Carlsen manages to liquidate into a queenless endgame. Queen takes, rook takes, and here in this position, these passed pawns on the king side are just too strong for Magnus. I mean, he's up 2 pawns in the endgame, but these passed pawns are monsters. And in the end, Fabiano tries, but he's unable to hold off a raging Magnus Carlsen, and Magnus ends up cleaning up in the endgame, and on move 58, Fabiano Caruana resigns as there is simply no way to stop that pawn on the g7 square. Wow, what a game. All right, getting into our fourth game of the day. It is Magnus Carlsen versus Levo Aronian from the 2011 Seinquefeld Cup. Now, this game is special because we are headed into the martial attack. That is one of the most important and powerful variations for Black in the Ruy Lopez. Now, real fast, the martial attack, we have e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez on the board. Now a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, and finally in the last 2 games we saw knight takes e4 and bishop c5, but now we finally see bishop e7 on the board. Now Black's idea here is he is threatening knight takes e4 now that the e-file has been blocked by the bishop. So here white goes rook e1, defending the pawn, and now here white is actually threatening bishop takes c6, then knight takes e5, so Black stops the threat, b5, bishop b3, and here in this position, Black has 2 main options, d6 and castles. Now, the martial attack is defined by the move castles. Here, Black is trying to delay the move d6 because he may want to go d5 in one move, depending on what white does here in this position. Now, in case you don't know, the martial attack for Black is defined by the move c3. White, of course, wants to go d4, getting that beautiful pawn center in the middle of the board. However, here, black does not allow it. He goes for the move d5. This is the martial attack, and here black is actually sacrificing that pawn on e5. Now from here, the main line goes e takes, knight takes, knight takes, knight takes, rook takes. So far white is up a pawn. He has one more central pawn. However, white has an exposed king, and black very quickly drums up a kingside attack with the move bishop d6, hitting the rook. Then the rook retreats, then queen h4, threatening queen takes h2, and white parries the attack with g3, but that does weaken the light squares around the king. And here black goes queen h3. His threat is bishop g4, perhaps rook a to e8, and from here black is going to get a very significant attack for the one pawn. Now the martial attack is widely regarded as roughly equal for black, so nowadays most players as white do not play c3, allowing the martial attack. Instead of that, there are a wide variety of moves that white plays here on move 8. Now the most popular anti-martial moves for white here on move 8 are a4, h3, and d3. Of course, all of these moves have a lot of theory, but in the game, Magnus Carlsen goes for the traditional one and perhaps the strongest move in this position, and that is the move a4. So what's the idea? Well, first of all, d5 is not a threat. If black does that, he just loses a pawn. Then white goes knight c3 with a great game. So overall, d5 not a threat. Beyond that, Magnus Carlsen already is threatening a takes, and then rook takes. So that is a very big threat, and black has to find a way to deal with that. Now, in the game, Levo Aronian plays the classical move b4. This is the strongest move in the position. However, lately, there are other ideas that black players of the martial attack are playing. For example, Ding Liren has played quite a bit of bishop b7 here, and Magnus Carlsen himself, when he plays the martial attack as black, he tends to go rook b8 lately, so quite a few playable options for black. Now b4 on the board from Levo Aronian, and Magnus plays the best move in the position, that is a5. Now this is a very tricky idea. Here Magnus Carlsen is trying to separate these pawns on the queen side, and they may both be weak later in the game. And beyond that, this move a5 does gain some more space and gives the rook and the bishop access to the a4 square. Now Levo Aronian, he plays the best move for black here, d6, simply bolstering that pawn center, and of course offering the e6 square for the bishop. And that is going to be a very important resource, as it is very important for black in this line to oppose that bishop on b3 in some capacity. Now here Magnus Carlsen has a very big choice. He spent the last two moves pushing that a pawn up the board, but now he has to decide how does he want to arrange his pawns in the center. So here there are two main options for white, the move d3 and the move c3. Now they both have their own pros and cons, but in the game Magnus chooses the move d3. This is a very solid move, and from here Magnus intends knight b to d2, perhaps he'll go c3 later, and then from there he either wants to push d4 or go knight f1 to g3. So in the game, what does Levo Aronian do? He plays the best move, bishop e6, simply opposing that bishop on the b3 square. Now the drawback of this move is Magnus Carlsen has the option of taking on e6, which he does in the game, and then after f takes, Levo Aronian is going to have those doubled pawns on the e-file. Now this is not necessarily a bad thing, as those pawns do control a lot of very important squares in the position. For example, that f5 square is no longer available for a white knight. However, overall it does seem like white has the slightly better pawn structure and a small advantage in this position. Now from here, both sides follow the main line, Magnus bringing his knight to the d2 square, and Levo Aronian bolstering that pawn on the b4 square with rook b8. And of course, there are other benefits of this move. This rook may want to go to the b5 square in the future, attacking a5 and perhaps supporting a d5 break. So this rook is very, very active on the b file here. Now Magnus, he plays c3, very good move, threatening d4 perhaps on the next move. And the strongest move for black in this position is actually the move rook to b5. And believe it or not, black is threatening to win that pawn on a5 that Magnus pushed up there earlier. However, instead of this, here in this position, Levo Aronian plays a very curious idea, queen to e8. Okay, what is the idea behind this move? Well, first of all, that queen is eyeing the king side. It may want to go to the g6 square in the future. However, it also indirectly eyes e6, and there are even some lines where white's going to go queen a4, threatening the knight on c6, and the queen preemptively defends the knight. So overall, e8 is a better square for the the queen. Now Magnus, he starts to continue development. He goes knight to c4, a very interesting idea. Perhaps the knight is going to go back to the e3 square at some point. And Levo Aronian, surely enough, queen g6. So here Levon may be thinking about knight h5 to f4 at some point in the future, at which point the queen and the knight are teaming up, attacking the g2 pawn. So Levon already may have some very aggressive intentions in this game. Now from here, Magnus h3, trying to control the g4 square. And instead of that knight h5 idea, here Levon, he plays something completely different. He retreats the knight back to the d7 square. Now, believe it or not, this is actually a very common idea in both the Ruy Lopez and the Italian game. And this move does a few things. First of all, it frees the f6 square for the bishop, and the bishop may actually be quite well placed there. But beyond that, this knight d7 idea bolsters the e5 pawn, and that means black may be thinking about the d5 break next, at which point that d pawn is no longer defending e5, so having the knight here on d7 defending e5 is very useful. Okay, Magnus, what does he do? Bishop e3, getting the last piece into the game. And now, as we discussed, Levo Aronian, he breaks in the center with the move d5. And of course, that move d5 is hitting the pawns on e4 and c4, and Magnus has to decide what to do. Now, first of all, taking on e5, believe it or not, is just a big blunder. Here, black takes back, white has to move the knight, and then this pawn on d3 is going to fall. I mean, Levon could just take on b3 twice, then queen takes d3, and here he is up a clean pawn with a dominant center, and Magnus Carlsen would be in a lot of trouble. So instead of that, here on move 17, Magnus just retreats the knight back to the d2 square. And it may seem a little bit silly to go knight c4 and then back to the d2 square. However, here it is a very good idea. I mean, from d2, the knight simply supports the pawn on e4, and Levon is never going to want to take on the e4 square with his pawn, because if he did that, for example, d takes e4, d takes e4, suddenly Levon would have these doubled, isolated pawns on the e-file. They would just be absolutely horrific, and Magnus would have a long-term strategic advantage in this type of position. So instead of that, what is Levon supposed to do here? Well, it turns out the best move is actually bishop to d6. From there, the bishop is very well centralized, and it does support the e5 pawn. However, Levon, he was thinking about something a little bit more active. First, he takes the pawn on c3. Not a bad idea in itself. However, he follows up knight c5, and this is looking a little bit premature. And surely enough, Magnus Carlsen, he finds a way to punish this idea immediately. He starts with the move bishop takes c5, black takes back, and then Magnus swings his queen over to the queen side with the move queen a4. Now, I talked earlier about the benefits of that move a4 to a5, clearing the a4 square potentially for the queen, and finally we're seeing that benefit in action. So from a4, the queen does a great job of defending e4, it pressures the knight on c6, and overall it's just kind of a menace in the position. So here Levo Aronian, he's in a little bit of a bind. He has to start thinking defensively, and the computer says the best move here for black is knight to e7, simply getting the knight out of the way of the attack of the queen. However, Levon, he was not in the mood to defend. Instead, he immediately counterattacks with the bizarre looking move rook to b2. Now, at first glance, this move looks insane. I mean, the knight on d2 is defended by the knight on f3. The rook cannot take it, and meanwhile, Levon is simply hanging a knight on c6. Okay, so what the heck was Levo Aronian's idea? This guy, at the time in 2011, was rated over 2,800. I'm willing to bet he did not just sacrifice a knight for no reason. Well, let's find out. If Magnus were to take on c6, now he didn't do this in the game, but if he did do this, here is Levo Aronian's idea. The key move in this position, believe it or not, is bishop takes f2. You sacrifice the knight and then the bishop. And here's why. First of all, the king should not take the bishop. If it does, king takes f2, then the knight on f3 is pinned to the king, and that means Levon has the disgusting move rook takes d2. Oh my goodness, the king would have to move and the attack rages on. That is just a disaster. Okay, so instead of that, here after bishop takes f2, Magnus would have to retreat the king somewhere else, say king h1. But then that means that rook on e1 is hanging, and he would just take it. Bishop takes e1, rook takes, and here Levo Aronian would have one last disgusting trick up his sleeve. That is the move rook takes f3. Now, the idea behind this is if the g-pawn takes back, Levo Aronian takes the knight. However, if Magnus were to take with the knight, then you have queen takes g2, checkmate. Oh my goodness, this is just a disaster. So with that in mind, on move 21, Magnus Carlsen did not take that knight on c6. Instead, he immediately defended with the move rook to f1, just bolstering that f2 square. So Magnus Carlsen demonstrating his sagacity in this game with a very clever idea, rook f1, stopping all tactics based on bishop takes f2. Now, Levo Aronian, once again, he has to do something about that knight on the c6 square, and he does that by retreating to a7. Now, yes, this does get the knight out of the attack, but I gotta say, I do not like the a7 square for the knight in this position. And Magnus, he capitalizes on the fact the knight is no longer defending e5. He simply jumps in and takes the pawn and hitting the queen. And from here, the queen moves, and Magnus just slowly but surely fortifies his king side, bringing all the pieces over here. Rook a to e1, centralizing the rooks. And after knight takes c3, Magnus jumps in with the queen c6, and the queen is just wreaking havoc in the black position. Of course, Levo Aronian is not out of the game, but here Magnus Carlsen really demonstrating the strength of the Ruy Lopez, how he can just slowly squeeze the life out of his opponent. Okay, Levon, bishop b4, he's setting up an x-ray attack on the rook on e1. So what does Magnus do about it? Well, believe it or not, he ignores it and goes king to h1. Oh my goodness. All right, here, Levo Aronian takes on e4. Magnus takes back, and now Levon goes knight to e2. And this was partially the idea of king to h1 earlier. Magnus Carlsen wanted to get his king out of the way of the attack of knight e2 so it wouldn't hit the king with tempo. So Magnus Carlsen seeing into the future, my goodness. Now here, Magnus rook b1 offering a rook trade. Levo Aronian accepts, and now Levon, his bishop's being attacked on the b4 square, and with that in mind, he retreats bishop d6. Now, in this position, that pawn on a6 is hanging, and Magnus Carlsen does decide to take it. However, this was a slightly dubious move, and this seems to let Levo Aronian back into the game at least a little bit. Now, the problem with this move is the queen is so far away from the king side, and black is starting to gain some time there. Instead of queen takes a6, the best move for Magnus Carlsen here was knight to g4. And the idea behind this move is you are hitting the queen, but once the queen moves, then you go e5, trying to lock down the center. Then, of course, the bishop moves, and finally, you just win that pawn on e6. And all of Magnus Carlsen's pieces on the king side, both the knights and the queen, are all working together perfectly. However, compare this position here to the one we have in the game after queen takes a6. And it looks like Magnus might be stretched a little bit too thin here. Yes, he does have that wonderful pass pawn on the a5 square. However, Levon, he may be able to drum up some sort of attack here. And that is what happens. Knight f4. Levon getting the knight back to the perfect f4 square. Okay, Magnus, queen b5, clearing the way for the pawn, but is it enough? Well, it turns out here, Levo Aronian has a beautiful pawn sacrifice. That is the move c6. Okay, why is this move so strong? Well, first of all, if Magnus Carlsen did take on c6, queen takes c6, then the idea is bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, and queen g5. And suddenly, look at this. The queen, the knight, and the rook all ganging up on the white king, and white's pieces are kind of far away from the king side. Of course, the immediate threat is queen takes g2 checkmate. White would have to deal with that, but still, this is quite dangerous. However, instead of that, Levo Aronian misses the pawn sacrifice, instead playing the move c5. Now, the idea of this move is very obvious. That pawn on c5 is blocking the queen's communication with the king side. However, it's too slow. Here, Magnus Carlsen, he seizes the opportunity, and he just wants to push that pawn all the way down the board to make it a queen. Oh my goodness. Okay, here Levo Aronian, he tries to counterattack. Bishop takes e5, knight takes, and now queen g5, once again threatening checkmate on the g2 square. However, Magnus, he finally finds that knight g4 idea. He blocks the threat, and how is Levo Aronian going to continue? Well, he starts h5, trying to keep the attack going, but now Magnus, knight e3, simply retreating the knight and defending the g2 square with the knight. Oh man, if Levo Aronian doesn't figure out something fast, that pawn is going to remote, and he is going to be dead lost. And with that in mind, here on move 35, Levo Aronian goes for a last-ditch knight sacrifice. He dumps the knight on g2. Oh my goodness, what's the idea? After knight takes, the rook comes in, rook takes f2, and here Levo Aronian is suddenly threatening checkmate on the g2 square. Oh, the audacity of this man. Okay, Magnus Carlsen, he does not miss that. He goes rook g1 defending. And how is Levo Aronian supposed to continue the attack? Well, he brings his king to h7, but Magnus retreats the queen, and it looks like he's defending. Okay, queen e5, perhaps there's going to be some sort of queen h2 threat in the future, but Magnus, queen e3, hitting the rook. And here, black has almost nothing. He ditches the attack, goes rook a2, trying to eye that pawn on the a6 square. But Magnus, he simply offers a queen trade. And sooner or later, those queens are going to come off the board. Levon tries to fight, but eventually the queens get traded. And here, white has a clearly winning endgame. He has a knight versus the 2 extra pawns from black, but he also has that advanced pawn on the a6 square. And it turns out this is just too much of an advantage. In the end, Magnus Carlsen easily cleans up the endgame, and on move 52, Levo Aronian resigns to the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen himself. Wow, what a game. All right, it is the last game of the video, and in the last video, we saw how Magnus Carlsen attacks the martial attack with the clever move 8a4. However, in this video, we're going to see what happens when black does not go for the martial attack, and instead, on move 7, instead of short castles here, he's going to go for the old move 7d6. Now, this is the traditional closed Ruy Lopez. Black has a huge number of different options here, and I'll cover those in 1 minute. So first of all, what the heck is white supposed to do here? Well, as usual, the main idea is to take control of the center with the move c3 and d4. So the standard move here is c3, black's going to castle, and now before you go d4, it is important to cover that g4 square with the move h3. So that is what Magnus does. If you don't do that and go d4 immediately, then bishop g4 is a very strong move, and ultimately black should be able to equalize in this line. So instead of that, the move 9h3 was played by Magnus Carlsen, and this is the main starting point of the traditional closed Ruy Lopez. Now, in the game, Magnus Carlsen's opponent, Bassem Amin, he goes for the Breyer variation, starting with the move knight to b8. Now, this is a good time to stop and talk strategy. Now, Magnus Carlsen as white in the Ruy Lopez, his idea is very, very simple. He wants to go d4, then bring his knight to the g3 square via d2, then f1, then g3. And from there, he can pretty much do whatever he wants. If he wants to attack on the queen side with a4, perhaps b4 at some point, he can even gain space in the center with the move d5. And there are even certain lines in the closed Ruy Lopez where white is going to go rook f1 and then perhaps knight h2 and f4, trying to gain space on the king side. So in these lines, white can pretty much attack all over the board if he wants to, but before he does that, he does have to make sure he controls the center with move d4 and bringing the knight over to the g3 square. Now, black, on the other hand, he has to find a good way to rearrange his pieces and get counterplay in the center. Now, of course, there are a few ways of doing that. The classical Chigorin variation involves going knight a5, hitting the bishop. Then after bishop c2, you gain space on the queen side with the move c5. So that is one possibility here. Another good option for black is going to be the move bishop b7 or rook e8. This is known as the Zaitsev variation. For example, during the main line, bishop b7, then white goes d4, rook e8 from black, then knight b to d2, and then bishop to f8. Here, black has just enough pressure on the e4 pawn that white does not have time to go knight f1. And beyond the Zaitsev and the Chigorin, there are all sorts of other lines for black. The Smyslov with h6, the knight d7 is a line. Black can even go bishop b6 or a5. These are ideas that Fabiano Caruana, the number 3 rated player in the world, is a big fan of. However, instead of all that, in this position here, Bassem Amin goes for the very popular Breyer variation. Now, this is probably the most popular variation of the closed Ruy Lopez at the highest levels today. And black's idea is simple. He wants to bring that knight to the d7 square, the bishop goes to b7, then the rook goes to e8, bishop goes to f8, and black will counterattack on the queen side with the move c5. So overall, black pretty much gets the ideal setup for literally all of his pieces. However, as you might expect, there is a big drawback for this plan, and that is the fact that it does not put any pressure on the white center immediately, and that means Magnus Carlsen can pretty much get his perfect setup in the Ruy Lopez. And that is exactly what happens here. here. First, Magnus takes control of the center with the move d4. Then black brings his knight to d7, and Magnus brings his knight to d2. Again, the idea is knight f1 to g3. Now, from here, Amin attacks the pawn on e4 with the bishop. Magnus defends with bishop c2, and now Amin prepares the idea of rook e8 and bishop f8. He starts rook e8, and Magnus, just in time, swings his knight over to the g3 square, just in time to defend that e4 pawn from the rook. Of course, black was threatening e takes d4, at which point the rook would be attacking the pawn on e4. Now, from here, white has various threats based on knight f5, so black takes a moment to stop that with the move g6. Now, this move is very double-edged. It does control the f5 square. However, it does create some weaknesses on the dark squares on the king side. And Magnus, he immediately capitalizes on that fact with the move bishop to g5. Of course, Magnus Carlsen's idea here is he wants to go queen d2, piling up that pressure on those dark squares. So here, black immediately responds with the move h6. And here, Magnus, typically the best square for the bishop would be e3. However, that would block the rook's communication with the pawn on e4. And ultimately, that pawn on e4 would be hanging. So Magnus cannot do that. So instead, he retreats the bishop to the very curious-looking square d2. Of course, Magnus Carlsen, his idea is going to be queen c1, again, trying to apply pressure on that diagonal. So with that in mind, Amin decides it is time to strike immediately in the center. First, he takes on d4, and then he attacks with the move c5, and Magnus responds with d5, gaining more space in the middle of the board. Now, funnily enough, we have some sort of modern Benini structure on the board that you would typically see after the move 1d4. So if we slow down and talk strategy here white does have a very good space advantage in the middle of the board. In addition to that, black has some kingside weaknesses, especially on the dark squares, and even black's queenside looks a little bit shaky. Now, on the other hand, black does have a queenside space advantage, and he does have some very active pieces all over the board. I mean, the bishop on b7, if this pawn on d5 ever falls, it'll be very well positioned. The bishop on f8 is going to be very well placed on g7, and beyond that, the rooks and the knights are pretty well placed for black. So we have a very tense double-edged fight ahead. I mean, what a better way to finish this series on Magnus Carlsen playing the Ruy Lopez. Now from here, black starts bishop g7, getting the bishop on that perfect long diagonal. And now Magnus, he replaces the bishop from d2 to the f4 square. Now this move is excellent. It targets d6 immediately. Black is going to have to find some way to defend, and from there, Magnus can go queen d2, pressuring h6. So Amin, queen e7, defending the pawn, and now Magnus, instead of going queen d2 right away, he decides to open a second line of attack on the queen side with the move a4. So Magnus literally playing all over the board here. Fantastic stuff. Now Amin, knight to b6. His idea, of course, is he wants to pressure the c4 and the a4 squares. So with that in mind, Magnus b3, immediately cutting off those squares from the knight. Now in this position, Amin should probably think about not doing anything too drastic as black, but instead he immediately goes for it with the move b takes a4. So what's his idea? Well, Magnus takes back and Amin goes a5, trying to lock the queen side. However, here, I kind of feel like this benefits Magnus Carlsen more than it does Amin. I mean, Magnus is going to go rook b1 at some point. That rook will be tremendously active on the b file. And sure enough, Magnus right away, rook b1. Oh no, that rook is hitting the knight. It's hitting the bishop with an x-ray attack. What does black do? Well, Amin goes knight f to d7. Very good multi-purpose move, both defending that knight on the b6 square, opening up the diagonal for the bishop, and now the knight eyes the e5 square. All right, Magnus, queen c1, eyeing the h6 square with the bishop and the queen. Now Amin, king h7, simply defending, and this is where Magnus Carlsen really turns up the heat. The queen side is currently locked down, and the center is totally under control. So with that in mind, Magnus Carlsen opens up the third line of attack on the king side, and that's right, he starts with the move h4. Oh boy, the threat is simply h5, trying to blow everything open on the king side. And Amin, he does not realize how dangerous this is. He goes bishop a6, but this means Magnus can crash through with the move h5. Oh no, Amin is not long for this world. Okay, first of all, what does he do here? He goes knight to c4, trying to get the knight into the game. Of course, this was partially the idea of bishop a6. And now Magnus Carlsen, he has an unbelievable idea that pretty much ends the game on the spot if he finds it. So if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to figure out the idea for Magnus Carlsen in this position. Did you find it? Okay, I gotta keep going. The unbelievable idea for Magnus in this position. First of all, you take on g6. That's the obvious part. Black takes back. And here's the idea. You jump forward with the knight f5. Oh boy, that is just a clean sacrifice of the knight. You're literally not even winning a piece. You just jump forward. Now, if black does nothing, you are threatening both the queen and the bishop on g7. If that bishop falls, that is going to be a nightmare for black, so we cannot allow that to happen. So if black takes the knight, here's the idea. Magnus would take back with the e-pawn, exposing the queen to the rook. Now, the queen has to move. Let's say queen f7, but then you go f6 with check. Of course, the bishop is now hitting the king on this diagonal. Then the king goes, and finally, you take the bishop on g7 anyway. And here, Magnus wins back material, and black's king side is just so exposed. Black's king is not long for this world. So, of course, that would have been the strongest idea. However, Magnus Carlsen does not find this combination. Instead, here, he goes knight to f1. I'm going to be honest, I don't quite understand the idea behind this move, but we got to keep going here. Okay, black, rook a to b8, offering a rook trade. Magnus accepts. Rook takes, and now bishop d3. Both the queen and the bishop are now putting pressure on that knight. Well, black finds the best move. Rook b4, defending with the forward rook. And here, the position is getting absolutely crazy. I mean, black is pressuring that pawn on a4, black attacking on the queen side. Meanwhile, white is pretty much all in on the king side, trying to blow open the black king here. Okay, Magnus, he starts to continue the attack with the move, knight 1 to h2. So this was the idea of knight f1 earlier. Again, this is such an ultra sophisticated idea by Magnus. His idea is he wants to go knight g4, putting more pressure on the h6 square. Now black, he takes the pawn on a4. Oh my goodness, black officially has a pass pawn on the a5 square. Oh boy, Magnus, he's going to have to strike and strike fast. He starts h takes g6, f takes, and now the big break, e5. Okay, this move is insane. I mean, let's count the pieces. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces blocking the e5 square. But does Magnus Carlsen care? No, he does not. He just goes for it. Oh my goodness, who does this guy think he is in this game? Magnus Carlsen? Alright, seriously though, the idea behind this move is Magnus is trying to clear the diagonal for the bishop and open up this e-file for the rook on the e1 square. And if he has to sacrifice a pawn to meet those objectives, then so be it. Now here, black plays the best move. Knight d takes e5, but Magnus, he saw ahead and he plays the unbelievable move. You know what? Go ahead and pause the video right now. I'm not going to give it away just yet. Here's your chance. Pause the video and try to find this idea by Magnus Carlsen. This one is cool, but it's not too hard. If you can find it, I'm going to say you deserve 3 out of 5 Happy Meals. Did you find it? All right, time's up. The idea is you sacrifice the bishop on g6. Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, the knight can't take it because the knight is pinned to the queen, so that's out of the question. However, if the king takes, then Magnus goes queen c2, forking the king and the rook. Oh boy, for example, king takes queen c2, Magnus is going to clean up the rook, and that's going to be all she wrote. Now, instead of all this madness, the best move here is actually king g8, simply running away with the king. But then the best move for Magnus, this is just silly. It is just absurd. You chase the king with the bishop. Oh my goodness. Then the king has to run away again because you're still threatening queen c2 check with the fork. So king f8, and then bishop takes h6, and the bishop is pinned. Oh my goodness. Black is getting just blown off the board. But instead of this, Amin, he takes the bishop with the knight. Oh no, here Magnus, he wins the queen, then he goes queen c2 anyway, then knight g6, queen takes a4, and from here it's all over. They play a couple more moves, and this is all she wrote. On move 38, Amin simply resigns to the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game. Now, if you made it this far, I genuinely hope you got some value out of this video. I hope hope you enjoyed it. So with that in mind, please do me a huge favor. Go ahead and smash that subscribe button to make sure you get notified on all of my latest opening theory videos like this one. And while you're at it, go ahead and check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist. I'm sure you're going to love it. And I will see you in the next video.